Thank you so much, Anthony. And let me introduce Hélène. Hélène Landemore is Associate Professor at Political Science at Yale. She is doing research, wonderful research, and also teaches in areas of democratic theory, political epistemology, theories of justice, philosophy of social science, constitutional theory, and also workplace democracy. Hélène has published widely in these areas, including a book on David Hume and a very important 2013 book called Democratic Reason, which provided an epistemic defense of democracy. I'm really excited about a forthcoming volume she has co-edited with Lucy Bernholtz and Rob Reich on digital technology and democratic theory. So we might touch on some of that tonight as well. So she also has worked with governments and various democratic experiments around the world, but maybe we'll get into that as we proceed with the discussion. So thank you so much, Hélène, for being here.
Thank you, Vafa. Thank you again, Anthony, for inviting me.
So let me just jump in. Why do we need a new theory of democracy? As Anthony said, there's so many books in the last few years on democracy. Why do we need a new theory?
Yeah, it's a good question. We already have a lot of adjectives, right? We have deliberative democracy, agonistic democracy, adversarial democracy, aggregative democracy, all kinds of things. But I feel like we've never really drawn the lesson that Bernard Manin sort of taught us, in the mid-90s, that really if there's a problem with election, it's that they are oligarchic at the end of the day. You know, the Greeks taught us that, but we've never really listened or considered that seriously enough. And honestly, for a long time, I didn't either. But I think now we've reached a point where the crisis is so obvious, the crisis of representative institutions, the crisis of electoral democracy, the crisis of party democracy, that we have to ask ourselves, is it really contingent? Is it really just because of external factors like globalization, which certainly weakens sovereignty at the nation state level, especially for smaller countries? Is it really just because of technological change, which rewards the more educated so enormously that it creates all kinds of wealth inequalities that in turn further weaken political institutions? Is it just capitalism, another big culprit? Or is it, at the end of the day, something internal to our institutions, and in particular to the logic of electoral politics? And having thought about this for many years now, and thought about what we should value about democracy and what democracy should mean, I think that it's indeed time to perhaps think anew what we really mean by the power of the people, and especially this definition of democracy that's very often quoted, but I think not understood that well, which is democracy is rule of the people, by the people, and for the people. I think we've focused a lot on the first and the third terms of the definition: of the people, popular sovereignty, for the people, good governance. But what about by the people? Where are the people in our current institutions? They only vote a couple of times in a lifetime. They don't really have a direct say on anything, except when you have the occasional referendum, but it's kind of rare outside of countries like Switzerland. So let's rethink that. Like, let's rethink dogmas like, well, we live in a representative system, so of course we need elected officials, or, well, the US is a republic, not a democracy. All these things are just stale at this point, and so that's what I was trying to do. Think as if not as if there was no history or existing institutions, but as if I didn't have to stop at this common sort of assumptions, and I could rethink what it is to create a ruled by the people from scratch, more or less, without any constraints.
It's wonderful. I should just say thank you for writing such a marvelous book. It's a major contribution, I think, to the field, and also to public discourse. And I think the hope is that it has really inspires a lot of us to think more deeply about this question of the participation of ordinary people and citizens in democracy. And it's really a monumental achievement. I think instead of sort of, we see a lot of cynicism and a lot of, in response to that, a lot of minimalism about, holding on to what we have. But I think in the book, in Open Democracy, you really are searching for like pathways for real structural change and institutional innovation. And it's really an exciting book. I really, it's going to be exciting to see the reaction to it. But let me say, like, one thing that, there are perhaps not many, but there are certainly part of the book is what it does is take inspiration from and engage with the fragments of real world experimentation that do exist. And so I just thought, I wonder if, what's so special about Iceland? Why are you taken by Iceland? Why does it play such an important part of your story?
Because I think I was initially quite conservative myself in my thinking about democracy. I was drinking the Kool-Aid like everyone else, representation, elections. And then I happened to be invited to a conference in Iceland, and it's really completely by accident that I encountered this constitutional process that took place between 2010 and 2013, roughly. And I was stunned by the institutional imagination that they deployed, by the risks they took. I mean, they just basically ignored everything that political science had ever said, which, for example, there was this idea that, including by one of the people I admire the most, which is Jon Elster, right, who wrote and has been quoted numerous times, countless times, and the idea is that constitutions should be written behind closed doors, away from popular pressure, right? And they did the opposite. They wrote it in the open. They put their drafts online to get feedback from the population. They wrote it on the basis of a report based on the reflections of a sample of 950 randomly selected citizens. So, in a national forum in 2010, they convened these 950 people and they told them, okay, who are we? What is Iceland? What values does it want to uphold and see in its social contract? So that was the beginning of the process. Then they had an election for the Constituent Assembly, if you will, from which official politicians were excluded, so that only ordinary citizens could run. 25 were elected. They wrote a proposal in 4 months. As I said, crowdsourcing it to the larger population the whole time. And then at the end, the proposal was submitted to a referendum in 2012, October 2012, during which 2/3 of the voting population actually embraced the proposal. In the end, Parliament refused to vote on the proposal, and the proposal was never turned into a new social contract, an official law, if you will. But the fact is that when I looked at the different steps they took and the way they tried to be as inclusive as possible, and the way this inclusiveness reflected in the final text, especially compared to proposals by experts at the same time, which had written in a much more secluded and less inclusive manner, I was just stunned. I thought that was really visionary in many ways, that it took the idea of we the people as seriously as you could. And it's not entirely unprecedented, of course. I mean, you could say that in 1996, South Africa also had a very participatory constitutional moment. They said, it's your constitution. There was a whole campaign to invite people to submit their proposals. But it was just, it was upstream of the process when it came to actually writing the constitution. This was all done by parties and officials. And in fact, the input of the larger population made virtually no difference to the output. You also had Brazil, I think in 1989-8, where they also had a participatory moment where the influence of the population was kind of real, actually, on the list of rights in particular, which was probably actually too long. But really, the idea of including people in the writing moment itself was really interesting, and using new technologies to put drafts on Facebook and get feedback from people was really astonishing. And now it's been demonstrated that 10% of the suggestions online made a causal difference to the text. So it wasn't just for show, if you will. I think it's probably one of the first constitutions where we measured the difference that popular input made to the text. So that's what
Wonderful.
got me excited, if you want.
So I want to just pick up two ideas that come through in this incredible example. One is maybe it helps us get a handle on your concept of mini publics. I was wondering if you could just sort of try and describe what this concept is and how it fits into your broader framework. And then the other thing, yes. Maybe I'll come to the second point after that. Yeah.
Sorry, what's the second concept you want to?
Okay, so I'll just. And the other one was just no, I was just going to say the role of sort of crowdsourcing feedback, and also the sort of potential for using technology, yes. and using technology in new ways to sort of the way technology actually enables some of the ideas that you're presenting that perhaps in other historical periods wouldn't have been seen as feasible, but today maybe are much more feasible and plausible.
Mm. So let me start with the idea of the mini public. The idea of the mini public, it's just this idea that when it comes to legislating, we could go back to the Greek intuition that legislation should be made by ordinary citizens. And the way to select for ordinary citizens is through random selection. You know, one person, one lottery ticket, more or less, which we approximate as best as we can through stratified random sampling and various statistical techniques that, you know, choose people based on categories of gender, geography, education levels, etc., to form a body of a few hundreds, often much less, but still the idea would be a large enough group that's broadly representative of the larger population, and therefore is a mini portrait of the nation and is likely to think and deliberate the way the larger nation would if it had the capacity to really, you know, meet and reason together. So I think that for me is a form of what I call democratic representation. And by democratic representation, I precisely do not mean electoral representation. It's often a conflation that's made. We've narrowed the meaning of democratic representation too much, when in fact, I think what we should mean by democratic representation is a representation that is accessible to all on an equal basis. Meaning the function of being a representative, the function of speaking on behalf of your fellow citizens should be something that all of us can do at some point in our life, right? It should be an honor and an opportunity that's equally and widely distributed. So that means that for me, if you look at electoral representation, which is something that's not accessible to all, it's accessible to people with certain qualities of charisma, you know, rhetorical skills, perhaps wealth and connections. That means that really electoral representation for me is oligarchic, or at least partly oligarchic, even as it is democratically legitimate because we've embraced it since the 18th century and we've defined it as like the democratic norm, if you will. But to me, if really we take this idea of democraticity that I introduced seriously, it's all about equality and inclusiveness, and you only get that authentically through random selection, right? So a mini public, it's for me the body that's the most democratic representative you can have of a nation. Now, of course, as soon as you have representation, you have a form of closure, because you do create a body that's separate from the larger body of the citizenry. So you need some mechanism that maintain it open. So that's why I want at the center of this new democracy I have in mind an open mini public, that is a mini public chosen by lot, that is also porous to the inputs of the larger public and is transparent to the larger public, and is that way somewhat accountable to the larger public. So that means having a sort of virtual gallery surrounding that body, so that people can submit comments, exchange arguments with members, not enter themselves the deliberations, but at least provide fodder and material for the deliberations of that mini public. So the idea is to combine lotocratic forms of representation, so representation based on lot, on the mechanism of lot, with self-selected representation, which is, to my mind, another type of democratic representation, because it's open to all. Anybody can walk in a self-selected space, right? But that it's a kind of democratic representation to which I wouldn't necessarily assign legislative functions, because it's too biased and much less easy to render accountable properly to the entire community. But I still think the combination of a randomly selected mini public and a crowdsourced space where anybody can enter, and that anybody can enter and participate in is sort of the closest you can get to a democratic institution, a democratic way of organizing the center of power. So basically my vision for an open democracy, it's really a democracy in which the center of power is open to all on an equal basis over time through sortition and rotation, and in terms of the legislative function itself, and at every point in time when it comes to just the deliberation and the generation of ideas and the processing of information, if you will. So it's largely inspired, as I said, by the Greek example of the boule, combined with the public gatherings in the agora and later the picnics. It's also inspired very much by the Icelandic example, because they had a national forum. And so if you take this national forum and you imagine it connected like the elected assembly was to the larger public, you get something like, through crowdsourcing platforms, you get something like a mini public, if you will.
Great. Can I ask something about these, the participants? Are they, in your mind, I mean, the epistemic kind of function is clear, and the sort of, also it's interesting the way it relates to your early work about sort of collective intelligence and cognitive diversity. So those aspects, I think, come through. But one thing I'm trying to, when I was reading the book, I was trying to understand was, are the citizens sort of there expected to just sort of convey their personal preferences, their personal worldviews and insights? Or is it that there is some expectation that they conceive of the public interest or civic ideals that the sort of community or polity is also trying to pursue, and then they try and carry that forward? I mean, I'm creating a false dichotomy here, but you see what I'm getting at. What's totally, your concept of the citizen?
To my mind, it's a very theoretical distinction that completely dissolves in the reality of these citizens' assemblies as we observe them around the world. Because you see that when people are selected, they immediately take up the role of, in fact, representative. They're not there to fight for their own interests. They immediately want to speak for the general interest. and all these Rousseauvian notions that seem so antiquated, and they're there all the time in the vocabulary they use. They're not there selfishly. They're not there just to fight for their, own interests. They really see themselves as having been selected by pure chance and having no more right to be here than anyone else, but no less in a way. And so they feel invested with a function and a responsibility, and it's clearly one that demands that they see themselves as citizens first, right? So to me, it's not even a distinction that even makes sense empirically, because when they are placed in this kind of a situation, that's how they behave, with an orientation towards the common good. I mean,
it's brilliant. There's a line I think that really captures the your faith in the citizenry when about halfway through the book you say, if democracy rests at bottom on a faith in the ordinary citizen, then this faith should be reflected in the ways in which we treat its most democratic bodies. And yes. I mean, this sort of, for me, summarized the spirit of the book. And yes. Also this incredible, epigraph perfectly captures from W.B. Du Bois, the start of chapter 1. And I was really taken by this kind of thread that runs through this sort of faith in the ordinary person and their capacity that is often sort of maybe dismissed or marginalized. But it really comes through this idea that every citizen has this capacity to contribute.
Yes, and I think if you want, I see my book as basically forcing us to confront the truth about whether we really believe in democracy or not, because I feel like a lot of people who think of themselves as committed to democracy, in fact, when it comes down to making a decision about good governance or democracy, they prefer good governance. Therefore, they go for they realize they're actually committed to something much more meritocratic or aristocratic, because they truly believe that that's the best way to get good governance. Mm-hmm. And I feel like it's fine. You may make that choice, but let's not stop calling yourself a Democrat then, or stop identifying the regimes we live under as fully democratic, right? So all I'm saying in the book, and it's true that I rely on my previous work and the epistemic justification for democracy, but you don't have to buy that argument. The point is that it's an if-then kind of argument. Again, I'm just saying, if we are committed to democracy, then you have to realize it commits you to a form of rule that's a lot more radical than the regimes we live under. But the problem is that we've diluted the meaning of democracy so much. We've called democracy a regime that are, basically popularly endorsed, electocracies, or I'm not sure how to call them. They're not full-on oligarchies, but they're closer to that, in my view, than to actual democracies. So once you've labeled this kind of regime a democracy, you have no space to go further, because we're already there. And so people will say, well, let's democratize a little. So let's do some participatory experiments here and there. And it's all good and beautiful. We're already in the best of all possible worlds. But if that's the case, how come people are so dissatisfied with their institutions, are so dissatisfied with their parliaments in particular? If you see the approval rates of the American Congress, it's never been higher than 33% in the best of times. And it's been as low as 9%, I believe, in the worst of times. Like, how is it possible that a regime that's supposed to be by the people is so unsuccessful at being for the people in a way that people can actually acknowledge? And my belief is that in order for it to be fully for the people, in order for people to be, at least 50% happy with what they get, to have at least 50% of the population that's happy with what they get, it should be authentically by the people. But that's not what we have right now. We don't have that connection.
Can I ask, just to clarify, at the same time, you don't sort of dismiss the role of experts. So I just wondered if you might want to say something about the relationship between your open democracy and the role of experts in it, and the relationship between them and ordinary citizens?
I think we live in complex societies. You need experts, you need bureaucracies, you need the division of labor between the people who rule and the people who administrate, and the people who execute, the people who inform, the people who, bring the information, synthesize it, etc., etc. But what does that mean? It means that experts, there's a phrase I like, which summarizes my view, which is experts should be on tap, not on top, right? But we live in regimes where they're actually on top everywhere you turn, and they're on top in a sort of insidious ways, which is not even transparent. So that you realize that the people who are writing our laws today are government experts. Many of them are not elected. They're just, products of various meritocratic institutions, lawyers, etc., etc. In the US, it's often written by lobbies, and then it's validated briefly, in votes in Congress, but it's no longer elected officials who write the laws anyway, right? So I think that creep, that sort of expertocratic creep has to stop, and we need to return to the democratic intuition, which is that people who are going to live by certain rules should be the one making the rules. The people who are going to be affected by laws should be the one making the laws. That's the idea. And so in the French Citizens Convention on climate that I have observed for the last year, so it's one of the examples in the book, it was a very interesting experiment, in part because it involved so many experts. You had 150 randomly selected citizens, and in total there must have been at least 160 experts involved in giving lectures, providing legalistic support, helping them rephrase and formulate their proposals into the legalese that the French law requires for this to go through, to be applied and be put to a referendum or be debated in parliament, etc. And yet, I think that it's fair to say that it's not the experts who wrote the proposals and the law-like versions of these proposals at the end. It's truly the citizens. They co-constructed the product with the experts, but the experts were at their disposal. They were not making the calls when it came to adjudicating between values. You could see it, for example, in the way that the experts at the beginning pushed heavily for a carbon tax, because many experts, including many economists, are convinced that a carbon tax is the only possible solution for climate change and climate remediation. But the citizens didn't want that, at least not at this particular moment in French history after we had the Yellow Vest movement. So they just ignored this recommendation. So clearly the experts didn't have the last word on this. On other issues, they followed the experts, but I mean, they have to follow one way, or they have to get the material from somewhere, and it's a very technical topic, climate change. So obviously they are not going to reinvent the wheel. The other solution that they turn to, for example, is creating a crime of ecocide and having the French constitution recognize it, for example. This was something pushed by a former environment minister, Nicolas Hulot. So they do listen to some suggestions. They don't listen to others. They had full sovereignty over the final set of proposals, in my view, even as they very much learned and were helped. They learned from and were helped by the experts throughout.
So brilliant. We're going to go to questions in a moment. So maybe maybe the last thing I will ask is about earlier this year, you co-founded a movement called Democratizing Work. And in the closing parts of the book, you also allude to the relevance of open democracy to news sites, including, in particular, the workplace. So I wondered if you might want to just sort of conjecture for us, or just tell us a little bit about where your thinking is going on that, and perhaps either more generally, but specifically, what sort of insight open democracy sheds on the challenge of thinking about workplaces and inequality in the in the market.
Yeah. So I think ultimately it comes down to the fact that globalization remains a big challenge in the background, right? Even if you democratize along the lines of an open democracy at the nation state level, you still have all the problems caused by the fact that we've lost a lot of economic sovereignty because of the competition between states, because of the market pressures, because of all kinds of problems. Meanwhile, you have global threats like climate change that cannot be solved at the local level in a way, and by government, partly for the same reason. They cannot impose too many environmental restrictions on companies, otherwise they flee and go somewhere else, and then you have to deal with unemployment and all these issues. So what's the solution? Well, at the theoretical level, the solution, you thinking like a Hobbesian, is to say, well, we need a world state. We need an institution that's going to enforce on us, like following rules that are good for all of us, like preserving the environment, curbing green gas emission, things like that. And perhaps at the at the regional level, ensure some kind of solidarity between countries. For example, at the European level, if only we could get our acts together and stop competing fiscally with each other, then we could tax large corporations instead of letting them, not pay taxes and exploit workers, etc. So we know this is not achievable anytime soon, and it might not even be desirable, because of course, if you put that much power into the hands of a global leviathan, a lot of people are very uncomfortable with that. So the other solution, and perhaps the only good solution really, is to start from the bottom up by leveraging the power that citizens should be able to have within their companies as workers, right? So there are two types of arguments for that. One is an argument from justice. You might say, well, these places, these organizations, these economic organizations are places of power. There are lots of injustices. There are lots of reasons to care about the voice of workers, because, as my colleague Isabel Ferreras would say, they are investors in labor, and as such, they have an equal right to a say as the investors in capital. That's kind of like the intrinsic argument, if you will. But you can also have an instrumental argument for democratizing the governance of firms, which is that, well, it might make for more efficient companies, because workers will be happier, more productive, more free to organize their work. They will have a sense of justice, which is so important to human beings. And if we, trust ordinary people, ordinary workers, just the way I want us to trust ordinary citizens, they will care about the environment, and they will not support policies that exploit ruthlessly resources, that treat other workers poorly, that pollute their environment. And they won't do that partly because I think there's a decency to human beings that I fundamentally believe in, which gets lost at the top because all the incentives are wrong there. And we have a tendency to send to the top psychopaths and people who are, able to ruthlessly exploit others. So I think that already you have a clear sort of selection bias at the top. But also because workers do not have the luxury to protect themselves from the influence and consequences of bad environmental policies, conducted by their companies. The workers who, have their plant pollute a river will see their children suffer from that. So it's not a solution to everything, but I think that the fundamental decency of human beings combined with, a number of incentives for ordinary workers, I think would mitigate a lot more the damage to the environment than is currently the case in our oligarchic model of firm governance. At least that's the hope of that whole movement, right? We were a group of 9 women, and we believe that we need to democratize, decommodify work, give back dignity to workers, especially essential workers in this pandemic. And the hope is that as a byproduct of doing that, you'll also help limit the damage to the environment and save the planet.
Okay. Excellent. Let's go to questions. So let me start with a question from Rachel Smith. How would you respond to the objection that a demographically representative mini public is not sufficient in itself to represent a population politically because our deliberative contributions are too distinct?
You mean, is it because the sample is too small, or is it because you don't get a representation of party platforms in this assembly? I'm not entirely sure what the question is asking me.
I'm not sure. So maybe you can, okay, so we'll let Rachel try. Oh, maybe she's come back. Oh, no. Well, let's see if maybe she can clarify. Do you want me to, I'll keep going with other questions?
Well, okay, let me try.
Try.
Maybe it's, first of all, it depends on the size of this assembly. It depends whether it's open to the input of other people to make sure that whatever holes in representativeness can be filled that way. But the question at the end of the day that I often point to is that it's a comparative question, like compared to what, is it better or worse to have an open mini public? And I just want to say that compared to an elected assembly, you're more likely to have more views and more interests represented in a randomly selected assembly than in an elected assembly. And we saw it recently in France very clearly, to my mind, with the case of the yellow vests. So who are people in France who are from, urban environments, who need their cars, who are lower middle class, sometimes working class, and they hadn't been represented in the French parliament for a long time. They felt invisible. They felt completely ignored. That's why they put on a neon yellow vest to be seen, to be taken into account, to be recognized. And I think that in randomly selected assemblies, you would have had demographic profiles close to that of the yellow vest. In fact, I saw it because during the Great National Debate in 2019, I went to one of those regional citizen assembly that was organized in 21 regions of France. I mean, there were 21 of them in all 13 regions of France, and also in the ultramarine territories, and one for the youth. And I went to the one in Normandy, where I'm from. And of course, sure enough, you had a yellow vest hanging from one of the chair. You had yellow vest people in there in a way that you wouldn't see them in a parliament.
That was a really good answer for a question you didn't fully understand.
Well, I hope I answered it in the end, or perhaps
I think you might have answered it in the end. Okay, this question is from Naleli Delgado. What can do us as ordinary? I think the question is, what can ordinary citizens do to get closer to the idea of a democratic representation, and not only to electoral representation?
Well, you can start asking for it at your level, which might be the regional level, the city level, the village level. Ask existing officials whether they would consider bringing, as an advisory body. Initially, this is unlikely to be a binding sort of decision-making body. A group of randomly selected citizens on the model, for example, of what's being currently done, or what was recently done in Ostbelgien, which is the German-speaking region of Belgium. They have over there 27 randomly selected citizens who spent an entire year advising the local parliament, and the local parliament morally committed to following the recommendations of that group of 27 randomly selected citizens. And these 27 also were in charge of organizing, on topics of their choice, larger citizens' conventions who were convened to debate and make recommendations on very specific questions. So that's how you can start. You can also start, also if you're a student, doing it in your student organization. Why resort to elections to choose your leaders? Maybe offer random selection as an alternative. You'll be surprised to have profiles that would never have won an election turn out to be extremely good good leaders, or at least if it's a committee, an extremely diverse committee that makes proposals that are quite different. And it might change the mood, and it might change the nature of the politics that's conducted, and it might be for the better. You could do it at the level of your company if they would consider that, which is perhaps unlikely. But just spreading the awareness about these alternative forms of democratic representation, educating yourself about where that comes from, about ancient Greece, about what's going on in East Belgium, about what's going on around the world. From the OECD, which I think is available online, is called, the subtitle is Catching the Deliberative Wave. It was published in June 2020, and it documents 289 cases of such mini publics, such deliberative assemblies, if you will, citizens' assemblies, more accurately. So it will show you how common these experiments are. They might not be talked about much, they might not be on the news, but they're actually very much around us, and we just need to learn more about, you know, what citizens can do on their own. For me, the Icelandic experiment was a beginning, and the French Convention on Climate was a continuation, and from those two, at least, I've learned that ordinary citizens can actually make the law. This is not a conclusion that was foregone for me. I actually didn't believe they could. I thought the best function for a group of ordinary citizens was to set an agenda, kind of like the National Forum in Iceland. I didn't think they could actually write the law, but now I'm pretty convinced they can.
All right, so this is related. Roberto Niembro asks, however, he hasn't read the book, which is, I think, fair enough because it's just come out. He says, however, I was wondering.
It just came out. I still haven't have a copy myself. So.
Oh, wow. Okay. However, I was wondering how, this is from Roberto. However, I was wondering, how would you differentiate between the mini publics and the common referendums or public consultations we already know? Thank you.
Oh, it's very different because citizens' assemblies are really small. You have a few hundred people at most, right? Mostly in the range of 90 to 150 randomly selected citizens. So to me, it's a representative moment because you kind of, we collectively delegate some tasks to that subgroup amongst ourselves. A referendum for me is much closer to what we call direct democracy. It's as close as you can get to having the entire population, the entire voting population, come together en masse and make a decision collectively. And I think it's very important. And I think that, of course, we still need moments like that. It's just that it's not a sustainable way to rule a country, right? You cannot ask people to be voting on everything all the time, because it means they need to educate themselves on everything. And certainly in Switzerland, they do that quite frequently, but they don't do that all the time either. They also have representatives running the ordinary business for them. So these are two very different things. I think they're complementary, if you will. I think the mini publics are best for deep deliberation on various topics, for agenda setting, whereas direct democracy moments are there to basically make the final call, be the sovereign moment on momentous issues like, should we continue the European construction or not? Should we leave the European Union or not? Like the Brexit vote, just the big, or in the case of Ireland, most recently in 2018, do we decriminalize abortion or not? Do we authorize gay marriage or not? I mean, these are big value issues where clearly the people should have the final say, I think, and not experts.
Great.
And not even randomly selected people.
Okay, so there's quite an interesting It's sort of somewhat technical, but with big political, I think, social ramifications. Question from Rebecca Fritzl. She asks, what is the criteria for selecting a representative sample of the people, and who decides about that criteria? I'm thinking about the problem of the plurality of defining elements of one person's identity and the intersection of these different elements.
Right.
Interesting.
So it's an excellent question. I think for me, at the level of principles, there's nothing better than one person, one lottery ticket. That way, you do not essentialize anyone, whether it's by their gender, their race, their geography, their education, or anything. That was the Athenian model, right? So far, we've not been able to do that because our samples are small. The Boule was, 500 people. I think in general, mini publics are much smaller. And so if you count on pure randomness with such small numbers, you will end up with skewed samples. So we're trying to do something which is very imperfect, very problematic philosophically, which is that we stratify on various categories which are essentializing. I agree, it's not nice. I don't like it either. But I think essentializing on gender is probably okay, because after all, it's like a very large category, a very defining category, 50% men and women. I think it's acceptable. There are other large categories like education levels, socioeconomic levels, geography, I think, is also a relevant characteristic, especially if you're going to talk about climate change, which affects disproportionately certain areas. So you want to make sure you don't have just urban people in there, you want rural areas represented as well. I think it depends what your mini public is for. If it's for a generalist agenda, then in theory, you'd want absolutely everything. You'd want vegetarians, you'd want, I don't know, musicians. I mean, we could refine your categories ad infinitum. But if you're talking about a very specific topic, like, for example, climate change or an electoral law, I think it makes sense to sort of engineer your sample a little bit in a way that makes sense for the topic. So, for example, on climate change, the French Assembly didn't do that, but I always thought it was a mistake. They should have stratified on people's opinions on climate change, meaning to make sure that there were as many climato-skeptics in the sample as in the larger population, especially given the self-selection bias that enters these current versions of mini publics, because we're in liberal countries, we don't like to coerce people into doing anything, so we want volunteers. But when you want volunteers, you skew considerably the sample, so you have to correct for that. So that's why, even though I don't like essentializing people and putting them in boxes and categories, it's the second best, given that we can't have large enough groups and we can't force people to participate.
Great. There is a question here about, there's a few questions here about, so I'm going to bundle them up and just put it in a generic way. Basically, the relationship between between open democracy and sort of the status quo economic system or capitalism. And yeah, I'm just going to sort of leave it open for you to sort of maybe make a few salient points from your perspective, rather than trying to break it up into specific elements.
Yeah. Right. So it's the old question, is democracy, and especially open democracy, compatible with capitalism, right? So depends on what you mean by capitalism. So by capitalism, if you mean market economy, I think it's completely compatible. I think the market mechanism is very, efficient, provided it's sort of framed by all kinds of laws and democratic control. So I think that's compatible. What it might not be compatible with is pure ruled by shareholders, basically, by basically the governance of firms being solely in the hands of shareholders, because that creates forces in society that are contrary to or can be contrary to democratic interests and lead certain, well, what's hard not to call plutocrats, to try to co-opt and control the democratic processes by injecting tons of money in politics, by trying to push certain interests. So I think it's particularly true of electoral democracy, because electoral democracy lends itself to this kind of corruption, because they need money for campaigns and such. I don't believe that open democracy would be immune entirely to this kind of corrupting effect. So I think that you'd have to find a way to share the power of shareholders with workers. I also think that in order for open democracy to work, you'd have to create and cultivate an ethos of civic responsibility. And I think that starts at home, it starts in families, but it starts also at work. And you cannot be a capitalist slave at work all day long, all year long. Have to accept taking orders from above and not having a say about your working conditions, and then miraculously turn into an autonomous citizen in the political sphere. I think it's really hard to have this kind of cognitive dissonance and live in two separate worlds. And so I think in order for open democracy to work, you'd have to reconcile the world of economic power and the world of political power. And there is also a very basic reason, which is that you need time to be able to, if you're chosen, for example, to be part of a year-long mini-public, you need time. You need your employer to let you go, to give you the availability and the leisure to go and come back, and that's only going to be possible in the current context, where if workers have some kind of say on the governance of firms, so they can have these kind of rights encoded in firms, sort of constitutions, if you will.
Okay, great. I wanted to ask, maybe we have time for one or two more questions. So Ruben Veraniman asks, how can we address issues of democratic legitimacy when a randomly selected mini-public and an elected parliament take manifestly differing stances on a particular issue?
Yes, it's a fantastic question. Well, so for me, legitimacy is a very complicated notion, but it's basically got to do with majoritarian authorization plus a bunch of substantive constraints. And so, of course, you'd want randomly selected mini-publics to be authorized that way by a majority of the population and meet some substantive criteria of quality, I guess, in the way they're designed, in the way they're run, etc. We're not there yet, obviously. There hasn't been a single mini-public that's been authorized that way, meaning, by which I mean that either approved in its principle by a referendum or entrenched constitutionally, so that it's a sort of a meta law that says that whatever the mini-public decides is actually binding on the whole polity in a way that's legitimate. So currently we do have conflicts of legitimacy, and it's on the side of parliament. Parliaments are winning, of course, because they have been around for many years. They are constitutionally authorized. They're elected on top of it, which adds a second layer of legitimacy, because each of their members have been authorized by preferably a majority. So there's going to be, I predict that basically what's going to happen is that as elected officials lose in legitimacy, which they have been doing for years now, and mini publics gain in legitimacy, in sociological legitimacy and normative legitimacy, as they are being recognized by people like me, but you know, ordinary citizens as well, and we talk about them and their merits and demerits. There is going to be clashes and conflicts, and my hope is that as supporters of one type of democratic representation or the other argue, we're going to figure out the right way to distribute our powers among themselves, or rather transfer power from elected assemblies to randomly selected ones. But I think it's not going to be without a fight. And in the case of the French Convention on Climate Change, it's very clear that's exactly what's happening. The 150 randomly selected citizens said, were told by Macron that he would apply without filter 146 out of the 149 proposals. And now we see that Parliament is kicking and screaming and just is not willing to approve many of those proposals. And so we have the party logic versus the, you know, ordinary citizens logic, and it's not going terribly well at the moment.